Okay, now back to the audience and those people who are putting questions online. Name, affiliation, and we'll take a first round of questions. Start off in this corner here. Is there anybody in? Gentleman at the back there.
Thank you so much. The name is George Dakura. I'm a PhD student at the University of Reading, School of Agriculture, Policy and Development. My question is about food utilization. Food is not just food, as food utilization goes beyond the biological and nutritional dimensions. So I want to understand from the WFP, in terms of your food assistance initiatives, what measures do you put in place to ensure that the cultural food needs of your beneficiaries are met? Thank you.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Hello. Thank you very much for the presentation on WFP's excellent work. Thank you. My question's around sorry, Steve Brady, RTI International. My question starts around the increase in food insecurity in MICs. And I wonder how much of this is, as countries themselves graduate from LIC, MIC status, whether they take persistent food security problems with them, and how much of it's actually new countries with new problems. If it is new countries, and recognizing that this is a massive oversimplification, how much of that new problem is conflict-driven and how much is climate-driven? And then coming back to Christine's point around political solutions, do you believe that WFP has a role to play as a broker in addressing political solutions, or are you apolitical, dealing in mitigating food insecurity issues? Thank you.
Got one over here.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for all the presentations. Edward Pace, Africa Research Institute. I wonder if the panelists could just say something about the enormous, this is in the context of political systems, about the tremendous economic opportunities that these crises that we're addressing create. I mean, Somalia, last time round, classic example of this. A great many people make a great deal of money out of the crisis. And in terms of assessing, it's not quite to do with the political system, although some of the players in these situations are political players. Many of them are just straight businessmen and women. To what extent is this factored in? And what sort of research are you doing at WFP and World Vision and so forth to try and find ways of mitigating this? I mean, Yemen at the moment is another classic example where tremendously profitable networks are at play in terms of providing the sort of assistance that we're discussing today. Thank you.
Okay, well, just to complete this first round of questions, let me pick out one that's on the list here. From Sonsiama Kagbo from Mozambique, who'd like to ask. The work by Grace and her team in Sierra Leone was so risky it affected their nuclei families as members stigmatized burial teams. Should there be a policy to handle such issues after crises are over? Okay, this looks like it's referring to Ebola as well as food insecurity. Stigmatized burial teams and longer-term work in that area. Okay.
That might not be a question. So from this.
Have I got the wrong feed?
No, scroll.
Oh my goodness. Sorry about this. I don't have tablets and stuff like that, so
Scroll up. Keep going up. There we go.
Oh, sorry. No wonder I was confused by that. It's coming from another meeting. Technological idiot in command here. Sorry about that. So forget that last bit. We've got some good provocative questions there, particularly on the political role. And my goodness, that question about are you allowing people here to make very nice living out of this? Warwick, give us an answer to some of those questions.
Oh, thanks very much for the questions. George's question on food utilization and the importance of local diets and local food preferences. Indeed, this is something that we've taken fully on board, excuse me, such that if you look at the composition of WFP's food basket now compared to what it was 5-7 years ago, you'll see a few things. First, it's expanded significantly. The number of commodities is much bigger. Second, the quality has also a bigger range. So now many more processed goods and so on that in some contexts we find are very important. And third, of course, the nutritional quality of their diet or of the food basket has also expanded. There are many more nutritionally improved nutritionally improved products in the basket. So much of that is driven by what we know about the importance of quality, but also the importance of local needs and requirements. So it's very much a part of it. Steve's question on middle-income countries, yes, actually you picked on two things. First, there is a graduation issue in there. That some countries had challenges when they were low income, and these went with them into middle-income status. But what we're finding, and Kenya is a really good example, if you see what Kenya's been able to do now, dealing with this particular crisis, and what it asked WFP to do in support, actually it's very different from what it was 5-7 years ago. Now they have the program, and we are providing certain back office type, using the word loosely, for some of the interventions, we're providing support to them. Of course, there is still some work which is similar to the old work, but it's different because their demands are different. But also, like you say, there are some countries that were middle income before, but are middle income now, and then they've been hit by a conflict or some climate event. So both of those things happening. This middle income, the lower middle income, unstable, low-performing middle-income country. Actually, there are quite a few of them. When you look at, if you have a chance to look at one of the tables where we show the distribution of countries across that typology, there are many of those middle-income countries that are low-performing. But then on the plus side, and I think Steve's opening remarks about the opportunity that affords because of their own capacity to address their own issues actually is much bigger now than it used to be. I can only just really agree very much with the issue of the politics, which has come up quite a bit here. It's one of the main points of the report. WFP's role, and actually, I think, again, this is not a report about WFP, but we and others actually find ourselves dealing with the implications of these political problems day to day, finding solutions that actually we should not be asked to provide. And this does give us a need to be part of the discussion. I'm not sure we would use the word broker in the way that you did, but certainly being cognizant of the political content of what we do and trying to leverage that in positive ways is something that we do take on. Edward's point about the commercial dimension of crisis, I signaled it as one of the themes on the positive side, but I think that your point about the fact that there are networks and cartels and you name it, operate both in stable and unstable contexts, and you do need to be cognizant of that. I must say I'll be keen to understand a bit more of the research that you're doing. It's something that I don't think have addressed directly in that way, but we are aware of it. We have it's part of our risk mitigation agenda, if you like, and so we do have safeguards to try to address the implications of it. But I'd be interested to see what research you've done on that. I had a question, a response to the Ebola question, if you would leave. but I will leave it at that.
Trihadi, I'd be particularly interested to get your reaction to. We've had several comments that the big problem here is political, and I wouldn't expect you to disagree with that. But from the standpoint of world vision, trying to work in a world which does have political conflicts, where do you stand on that? What are the implications for world vision?
Very good. Thank you. I really appreciate these issues. I think this is a core. I fully agree that there must be a certain way how to address that issues. And thank you, gentlemen in the middle here, talking about, if I say, when we talk about unstable context, we use more and more the fragile context there. We need to be very careful differentiating this context into at least two groups. The first, I call it the unstable or could be low performers, because the dysfunctional of government in running the country. So you end up actually government that just dysfunctional or very low function. But then the second one that we need to really recognize is that what we call it a place where there is a protected war, protected conflict, that basically a long-term conflict happen all the time. And in that place, there is a stability of conflict, meaning there's a powers that have get benefit from it. And there is an economic of war that actually feeding into the powers, and they have all the interest to keep that conflict long-term, because they have a stand on it. So I think as a political system, we need to address those differently, at least those two groups differently. For us in World Vision, two things that we learn. First of all is that when it comes to the political solution, the challenge would be one voice, one policy for every parties, especially humanitarian agencies. WFP, World Vision, UN agencies, civil society, how we make sure we have the same one voice on that one. The challenge is that because it seems, even though we agree we need to address political system, doesn't mean that everybody have one voice. They may have a different way how to approaching those. The second approach that we address, and this World Vision doing all the time, is that strengthening our social accountability in every work that we do, including in the humanitarian response. Social accountability, we have what we call it the civil, citizen voice and action. That's actually empowering communities to speak up in terms of how they view the humanitarian response in that context. Have just three simple questions. Let's say if you address, let's say you do a food distribution, ask a simple question. Did we give you the right assistance? The second one is that, did we distribute and fairly and justly to the beneficiaries? Did we, when we distribute things, we respect you as a community, as a human being? So those kind of social accountability should be part of this conversation, because those are the seed for addressing the political system for the long term. Political solutions should also come out from the grassroots, from the community themselves, because they're the one that can sustain that peace and a political solution. I think that's the social accountability piece I would like to bring on the table. Thank you.
Okay, very nice. Yeah. Christina, would you like to pick up any of these points?
Sure, thank you. Maybe just 2 points. The first on the war economies question, and as colleagues have said, I think there are people that prolong war on purpose because they're benefiting from it. And we've, as I said earlier, HBG has just published a study on markets in crisis, where we looked at South Sudan, Mali, and Pakistan in particular, and how those markets operated in a conflict environment or a crisis environment. And I think what we looked at were the ways in which those market systems, fell apart under conflict and crisis, but also how certain aspects of those markets actually benefited and from the crisis itself. And I think the conclusion that we came to was that, really part of what we don't do very well as humanitarians, at least, is market analysis before deciding on how to intervene in a crisis, or whether or not to use cash or vouchers or food assistance, how to apply it, where to apply it. We've started doing that type of analysis. We look sort of now at the kind of the micro supply chains of those markets, but we haven't really been very good at analyzing the different players, the different stakeholders in those markets and what they mean in times of crisis. And I think we need to get a lot better at that. Not necessarily hiring humanitarians to do that type of analysis, but really incorporating, getting economists, getting market analysts in at the beginning of a response or during peacetime, or during those times of non-acute emergency where we can actually look at what's going on when you're not in a crisis situation to be able to understand better what happens during crisis itself. And then maybe just something on the colleague's point on what is the role of international organizations in trying to find political solutions to conflict and crisis. And thanks to colleagues, I was very interested in your responses on that. I think, certainly as humanitarians, we always take the stance that we're politically neutral. And so therefore, and I think you mentioned this, not really able to engage in some of the politics of what happens in conflict situations. I think we need to make a distinction between neutrality and being kind of politically naive. I think while we, don't play to either side, we actually do have to engage in the politics of conflict and crisis situations to be able to, at the very least, organize things better for ourselves and our access, but that also to press these countries for political solutions, or to press our own donors to be better at being bolder in finding political solutions. And to some extent, it's biting the hands that feed us if we're trying to put pressure on, for example, the UK government to stop arms sales to Saudi Arabia, or to monitor the ports in Yemen better so that the assistance can get through when it needs to get through. And I think that's really hard for large organizations to do. But I think, we do have that ability and that clout within donor organizations to be able to make those bold statements. And I think if we can act as one, as a humanitarian community, to hold our own donors to account for what they're doing, I think we could be much more effective at that.
Yeah. Halima, are you still with us?
Yes.
Halima, would you like to come in on some of these points? I mean, these very strong points have been made about the importance of politics, and the provocative comment about the war economy and people who are able to profit from such situations. Two really relevant questions with respect to Somalia. Do you have a comment on this?
Yes, on the point of the political, one of the solutions would be, it's not only WFP's, I think, mandate, but it's a collective effort that should be done by all humanitarian actors, but also emphasizing on donors, because donors have direct contact with the government. And we make sure that, the resilience building is the ultimate solution to this. For example, some of the countries, not all countries are like that, but some countries require an equipment and empowering of those local authorities to make sure that the effect of famine are actually fought against. And this is by strengthening the existing systems. That's on a political angle of it. But let's not forget also there's a dynamic force in Somalia, politically, environmentally, socially, which sometimes it couples what happens in all regions in Somalia. So, of course, there's constant of disasters, single disasters. For example, it could be in famine, you could hear of conflict. So sometimes it's a bit difficult for people to have a certain way of making sure that we deal with one thing and settle it and then go to another thing. So I think that dynamism also, it's a big issue, which is politically linked.
Okay. Now, we do have time for a few more questions from inside of the room or wherever. This side of the room, whether...
Thank you so much for your interesting presentations this morning. My name's Marion. I work with the Humanitarian Resilience and Gender Cluster here at ODI. Stephen, I'd be really interested in hearing your perspective on how WFP is working with national authorities to synchronise your food assistance data. You gave the example of Kenya before, and I'd be really interested to hear about more on that.
Okay. Gentleman here in the middle.
Paul Buffard, retired from WFP 6 years ago. Halima just mentioned 2011, which is when I retired, and my question really is to her. I think I was encouraged by what she said, that the crisis in Somalia in 2011 maybe was one of the worst hunger and deaths caused by food shortage this century. What lessons were learned? Have those lessons been implemented this time around? And from what Halima said, I think it sounded encouraging. Maybe, Christina, you could say something from the OCHA perspective there too. And secondly, I'd just like to comment a little bit on this question of the link between food assistance and the commercial sector in conflict situations. My experience working in countries such as Angola and Sudan is that, yes, it's expensive to move food, to procure food and so on, but WFP does have a very, very rigorous procurement system with competitive tendering, a lot of independent monitoring. So to put at rest the concern that there is a kind of free-for-all in terms of the commercial sector and providing food assistance, my own experience in a number of countries is that there is very rigorous control on expenditure through competitive tendering and committees and independent monitoring and auditing. So I'd just like to make that point from my own experience. Thank you.
Okay.
We've got one more.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation, panelists. My name is Antoinette Salah, and I'm an agricultural and food consultant. I have a couple of questions for Halima and also Steve. My question to Halima is, what is the most efficient or effective system in receiving food assistance for the IDP? Is it in kind or cash transfer? And also, have you identified any gender-based violence in the distribution of food assistance? The next question is to Steve. You've mentioned that you are facing systematic challenges. What is your organization, WFP, doing in overcoming these challenges?
Okay. Right. So let's take those questions we've got there in reverse order. Halima, there were a couple of questions to you. The question about what have we learnt in dealing with challenges in Somalia from the 2011 crisis, and have we got things better at the moment? What's most efficient and effective form of aid for internally displaced persons? And are we seeing incidences of gender-based violence in the distribution of food aid? Halima.
Yes, thank you very much. What has changed from 2011? We are now more organized. We were actually more organized a couple of months ago. We've seen a system of effective coordination, and this is across all humanitarian actors, from donors sitting on the same table with INGOs, sitting on the same table with UN and local actors. And also we've seen a lot of more local organizations coming on board and making sure that they act upon as quickly as possible for those who require the emergencies at those locations that are inaccessible, because local organizations have accessibility leeways as opposed to other INGOs and UN in terms of implementation of programs. But also we've seen effective coordination also from the government perspective. And this gave us more hope because of the National Drought Emergencies Response Committees that have been developed in 2016 were more engaging with all humanitarian actors in terms of having concerted efforts, and everybody knew what is going on and what data are coming in, what should we do next. So it was more government and humanitarian actors' involvement. The other one is about the scale-up humanitarian response. I think we were way better, in a better position than before in 2011 in terms of scaling up. We've seen very good practices from donors and telling those partners who implement their project to divert the funding opportunities that they were given in terms of programmatic interventions to the emergency response that is required at that particular moment. So it gave us more effective response, but I think the momentum should be something that we should be talking about in terms of to continue this kind of interventions. The other one is about contingency planning. We've seen more organizations being at the peak of saying that we should be designing this program like this, but redesign it again based on the needs that are coming in, which is something that we've not seen. So it was 2011, it was a strike, but this time we were prepared and we were trying to avert that famine. So I think we were in a better position to do so. The second question about the effectiveness of the systems as far as cash or food voucher, which one is better? As I previously mentioned, cash assistance was seen to be way better than the other food distributions that are done because it gave the opportunities for beneficiaries to have variety of food in their baskets, which is something that they really applauded. And to be honest, it's something that they should continue as WFP to make sure that we have more opportunities in terms of cash assistance. And donors, it's a selling point, and donors are really, really interested on this. And also gives, a bit of local actors being engaged as much as possible in terms of making sure that we link the needs to the main interventions that are doing by all actors. The third question is about the GBV incidents. Have we seen increase during the drought response at the moment? Yes, there was increase of incidents, and this is due to women walking all the way from their rural areas to coming to the urban, particularly Mogadishu, for example, and Baidoa. We've seen an increase of GBV incidents, and this is something that was contributed, of course, to the movement of IDPs, and also we've seen incidents mostly within the IDP communities as well, because of the relocations and all those challenges.
Thanks, Halima. We've got one or two more questions in on this feed here. The feed apparently had gone down. Now the feed's come back up, and suddenly we've got another 3 questions in here. So let me pick out some of these questions, and we can throw these ones into the mix. Looking at the bottom here, provocative question here from Saskia van der Kam from Médecins Sans Frontières. Does helping out the problem of Hurricane Harvey in Texas detract from food assistance anywhere else? Oscar Davis has a question where he said, should we be getting food aid from more regional and local sources? My information is it's cost an arm and a leg to move stuff around if you bring it in from a long time out there. Then a question from Paula Gill-Bison, who's Director of Cash Program at WFP, World Vision, sorry. With multipurpose cash growing as a way of providing assistance, and WFP providing a great majority of this cash assistance, how does WFP see the role and mandate evolving? And finally, from Debbie Hillier, who's at Oxfam, do we need more work on forecast-based actions, crisis modifiers, more flexible and adaptive programming to enable a swift response? Okay, my goodness, there's a great variety of elements in those questions with the ones we collected just a moment ago. Christina, we're coming back the other way down the line. Any comments on some of the issues we've just mentioned?
I think I had a question earlier about Somalia and whether the response today was better or improved from 2011. And I don't work for OCHA anymore, so I can't speak for OCHA, but I can speak at least from what we're seeing here at ODI. And just to pick up on what Halima was saying, we actually have seen a lot more coordination and better coordination from the beginning on this. We actually hosted a meeting last winter on this in Nairobi and here in London, bringing various people together to start thinking about the response when it was, or start thinking about early action when it was becoming apparent that was going to be required. So that already was a good start. I think faster and earlier cash assistance. And I also think that aid agencies were, I think one of the lessons from 2011 was that this remote management model of delivering aid wasn't working. And I think there's aid agencies, and I can't speak for operations, and maybe others can, but I think that aid agencies working in particularly al-Shabaab areas have managed to work sort of from these, from kind of points throughout the country where they're able to be a lot closer to the response than they were in 2011, and to be able to organize themselves to be a lot closer to what they're doing. And we've seen an improvement on that. But having said that, there are still the issues of counterterrorism legislation that are still very much in place in Somalia that prevent, and that's a political question, that prevent a lot of the access until a famine is declared. Once a famine is declared, then you actually can lift those those restrictions. But isn't it sad that we have to get to that to be able to get the access that we need? On forecasting, yes, I would absolutely agree with Debbie on that. The problem, I don't think, though, is that we don't have the information to enable response. I just don't think we act on the information once we have it to enable a response. So, I think that I think we're very good at projecting and predicting some of these. I just think that what we've seen is that once we have the information, there are all sorts of reasons, and largely political ones, for why we can't actually act on them. And I think that's what we have to get better at. Not the data. Certainly, more data, better data is always a requirement. But I think getting better at acting on that data in a way that makes our lives easier and gets us to the people we need to serve easier is more the issue.
Okay. Trihan.
I have no further comment, only one point that I really like about more creative in sourcing food where it comes from. I think that's a good point there. It's not just looking into the cost efficiencies, but also looking into economic opportunities to sourcing food. I think that's a really good point that mentioned. So I think that's only my comment. I think the rest would be Stephen. You got better place to make those comments.
Thanks. Could I answer a couple of the earlier questions as well?
Oh, yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Marion's, was Marion, yes? A question about beneficiary, data on beneficiaries and what we're doing with national authorities. Indeed, this is a major effort for us. We have developed a new platform called Scope that does that exactly, where we digital beneficiary recording, monitoring system that actually there's a lot of demand from national authorities to help them integrate this into their systems. In Uganda, Kenya, where the link is very much to the social protection platforms that they're putting in place, that they really value the objective basis for doing that this system of ours provides. The report actually goes into some detail on that, so if you have a chance, you can take a look. Paul, I was wondering, I knew that fellow from somewhere. I kept looking at him and saying, I think I know him. So, Paul, thanks for that, and nice to see you. Thanks for elaborating on actually what I just called safeguards. No, there's a huge effort to make sure that what turns out to be $3 billion of our portfolio in supply chain related activities that deals specifically with what you're describing, Edward, just to make sure that this is done in the right way. So, Paul, thanks for clarifying and elaborating on that. Antoinette, on the systemic challenges, yes, WFP has a lot of activities that deal specifically with those three systemic challenges. In terms of the bad ear problem, I think Christina signaled resilience is really an important element, or the lack of resilience is an important element of the degree to which a bad ear becomes a bad ear. You know, two different families, one which is more resilient than the other. A bad ear isn't a bad ear in the same way for each of them. So really, we have a big portfolio dealing with addressing that dimension of vulnerable households' capacities to cope. So resilience is a big part. So food for assets, cash for assets that enhance their capacity to cope. The last mile problem, a good example is our efforts to leverage our food purchases in ways that actually what Trihadi was describing earlier, where we leverage them and direct them towards certain vulnerable groups or certain resource-poor groups. So we have a big initiative called Purchase for Progress, where we want to devote 10% of our portfolio to smallholder farmers, and these are the people very much in that last mile, a big part of them, so that having this demand outlet gives them better incentives to adopt technologies and practices that improve their productivity. And then on the good ear issue, a good example of what we're trying to do is to work with governments on their public grain reserves so that they have better capacity to deal with this avalanche of grain which comes on the market at harvest time in many years. So there's some examples there, and the report does give some elaborate on that. Saskia, on implications of Harvey for food assistance, I'm not aware of any analysis of that, but maybe others are. Oscar, I just would agree with Trihadi. This is a big part of our. Oscar was he was on the line. Yes. Okay. Yeah. It's a big part of our work. We've had a long-term policy to ensure that, to the extent that we can, do it commercially in commercially viable ways. We would source food from locally and regionally. And so it turns out that up to 70% of the food that we purchase is purchased locally or regionally. So it's a big part of our activity, for the reasons that I mentioned. One, it's cheaper, but second, it also puts resources, puts income into these local economies. Polygil on the multi-purpose cash. Yes, this is growing in importance, and we are an important player in that. I think we still need to work through all of the questions which are implicit in what she said or he said. One point that we would mention is that many of these issues, many of these systemic challenges, also express themselves in humanitarian contexts. So it's important to even as we do multi-purpose cash, understand that ultimately we need to be addressing the systemic challenge. Otherwise, progress on the longer term issue, having that bridge between humanitarian context and the longer term, will be more difficult. So, yes, we're in that. We're part of it, but many issues still need to be resolved. And then finally, on Debbie's point about the forecasting, yes, this is huge for us and just about everybody in food assistance, because to do that, you need to understand how these food systems are evolving, and that requires some investment in looking ahead. And so as to be able, at the moment when you need to respond, you need to have that. But Christina's point is so important, that we have never been able to address all of the assessed needs that we identify. Never, because of funding issues, because of access issues, or whatever. So yes, we invest in forecasting, and I should probably signal that the next World Food Assistance report will deal with preparedness and response, because we know it's such an important issue, and forecasting is a big part of that. But just to affirm Christina's point, that really being able, once you've done the analysis, to respond and to act on it is many times the issue. So thanks.
Okay, well, we're out of time. What have I heard here today? a very simple and crude summary of some of the currents that we've heard today is that there are many things that have been said today where you just say, there is improvement. As always, there is improvement in responses, in programming, in learning from previous experiences. But that improvement is always a bit slower than you may think, and it's always not entirely adequate to deal with the scale of the challenges we've got. But there's no doubt when I listen to WFP today, and if I imagine what the discourse might have been 30 years ago in the mid-1980s, it's chalk from cheese. It's a great deal more sophisticated, it's a great deal more responsive, and almost certainly, and we know it from the macro figures, more effective. But against that world of slow and sometimes frustratingly slow improvement, we have the big challenges which are familiar to humanitarians, unexpected shocks, conflicts that seem to be very difficult to deal with, and inside of those conflicts, things that drive you round the bend, convenient cartels which actually make money out of things like that. And Christina's big comment here is making sure that principles of humanitarian action that, my goodness, were forged through so much debate and so on, are not just casually shunted aside in a narrative that says, oh, the world has changed and perhaps we don't need to bother with inconvenient things like humanitarian principles. And I love the points that we got from Halima, working in the difficult context of Somalia. I'm looking forward to the date when we talk about Somalia's problems in the past tense. It will be there. I will live to see it. And when Halima talks about building communities, local community action, local authorities, and building it up from there, those seem to me to have the resonance of there are the roots of the solutions to Somalia's conflicts. Thank you ever so much, Weri. Thank you, Trihadi. Thank you, Halima. Thank you, Christina. And thank you all in the room for coming along today, and those of you who are online.